So earlier on in this course, we introduced the concept of this entry point command. And most of the time in our Docker files, we have been using this entry point command. There was one example where I used the cmd command. And at the time, it didn't make sense to explain the difference because it would have derailed what we were talking about. And I did say I'd explain later on in the course what the difference was. So that's what this section is about. So what entry point does is it specifies the default entry point for the container. So basically when the container starts, the main process that will be executed. So in this case, this is going to run when the container starts, .NET with this as the argument to .NET. We can add cmd, and what cmd does, that adds default extra arguments. So if we say my arg1, my arg2, so these are default. So if we were to run like docker run my image, whatever this image is called, and then anything we do after that overrides the cmd. So if I just do docker run my image, it's going to do this. Then the arguments are going to be this, this, then this. If I then do my other arg, then because I've specified some arguments on this command line, it's going to override that because these are just the default ones if you don't specify an argument. So in this case, it's going to do that, and then what I've overridden it. If I remove entry point, then it's going to do that with that as an argument, providing I've not got any overrides. So if I do that, that is actually going to fail because my arg is not a command, because it's going to take, in this case, it's going to take the first one as the first command line option. If I override it and say ls, because there's no entry point, so without this ls, it's going to run that and that, which will fail because my arg1 isn't an executable. If I enter anything whatsoever, then it'll override that and ls will work because ls is a valid command. So let's undo all that. And I've got a Docker file which is empty at the moment, which we're going to use as an example. So if I say from Alpine, so that's the base image, and then let's say entry point echo hello. And then if I get up a new terminal, let's make this a bit bigger and change directory to that directory, and then do build. So docker build -t for tag. I'm going to call it entry point cmd. That's just the image name. I can call it whatever I like. And then dot for the current directory, which is the context. Now if we try and run this without any arguments, then it's going to say hello, echo hello. If I add another argument and say world, then that's added hello world. So you can see that even though we don't have a cmd, by specifying some commands on the command line of docker run, this is still overridden the cmd, even though we didn't have one in our Docker file. And now in here, if we do cmd, we can say hello world. So this is kind of saying that this is the default. So entry point, you can't override by specifying arguments after the image name. There is a way we can override it, which I'll explain in a sec. But by adding arguments, it will not override the entry point. It will always override the command though. So if I rebuild this now, and then let's run it again and remove the world, then that's using the default. If I bring the world back, that's overriding the default, which has the same value. If I change it for something else, then that's overriding it again. So you can see now that the entry point is kind of like the fixed main purpose of the container, the main process. And the cmd is default argument for if you don't specify them on the docker run command line. And if you look at the Docker Compose files, there's another YAML argument saying command as well. So you can specify these commands in your Docker Compose file as well. If we ditch entry point and try and run this, then as I mentioned before, world is not an executable, so it's going to fail. We can, in this case, override it because we've not got an entry point in just CMD. So if you remember, any arguments will override that. So if I do ls, then it's done on ls. If I change this to entry point ls and build this, then by specifying ls here, because it doesn't override that ls, it's probably going to complain saying there's no such directory as ls. Yep, because it's doing ls. But I could, if I remove that, that's going to do an ls. I could then do usr, for example, and that's done an ls usr. I did mention that if we wanted, we could override an entry point. If we do want to override the entry point, there is an argument saying entry point, and we can give it something else. Let's go for like PS. The last thing that's worth covering in this section is you may notice that I've used this syntax. So this is called the exec form. So basically it's parsed as JSON, and each entry needs to be in double quotes, and this is the recommended way of doing it. Another way, which is called the shell form, you can do that. Now what this will actually do is it'll basically, when it runs the command, it'll do bin sh -c and then whatever your command was, which isn't always what you want. And the recommended way is just to let Docker execute it for you, which is using that syntax. In fact, let me just undo. So hopefully that clarifies the difference. And earlier in this course where we used entry point, we could have used command. It didn't really matter for that particular example. We're always running our .NET API or our Blazor application, so we don't need to override it. Sometimes though, it's definitely worth knowing that if you, do you know when we do docker run -it rm some image, and then we say bash on the end, or sh, if a Docker image is built using entry point, that probably won't work. And if you find that you do sh and you do bash and you don't get a shell, then you can kind of like force it by doing that entry point thing. So you can do like entry point bash, and that kind of forces your way into it. So just trial and error. Most of the time, doing bash on the end or sh on the end will probably get you a shell. If not, then just use the entry point command. Now, you may have noticed in this course that we type the word Docker an awful lot. And when you're doing Docker Compose, that's even longer. So as a little tip, I recommend in your PowerShell or Bash profile to actually set up aliases. So if we look at mine, so I've obviously got a bunch of other stuff in my profile, my PowerShell profile, but the key bits is this. And I've commented them out because using D and DC is so ingrained in my muscle memory that I would do it throughout this course without realizing it if I hadn't commented out to force myself to write the full command. But now we're at this stage of the course, I'm happy to say I can uncomment it out, which means that if I go back and open up a new shell, then now I can do dps or drun and then whatever arguments. I can do dc up for Docker Compose up, and it just makes it a lot faster and saves unnecessary typing. And you can see I've got a few more like G for Git. If you do use Kubernetes, K for the kubectl command, which is kind of like the main command line tool used when using Kubernetes. If you use .NET, DN for .NET. So it's just a nice way of saving a bit of time, making it a bit faster to type these commands, because if you're using Docker a lot, you will type these commands a lot. So whilst I said earlier on in this course that I wouldn't be covering Docker Swarm, it would still be remiss of me not to talk about hosting at all. But given there are so many different types of cloud services that you can host containers on, I'm just going to summarize a few. First though, a quick reminder of how the flow of images and containers work. So if you remember, we covered this diagram earlier on in this course. So you or an CI/CD system would build your image and push it to a container registry or an image registry. The names are used interchangeably. And then either another person, so it might be a colleague, can pull that image down and create a container from it. That can also be your hosting solution. And that's generally, no matter whether you use Kubernetes or used something else, which we'll talk about shortly, everything kind of follows this same pattern where the hosting solution will pull down the image and create containers from that image. But in production, we obviously have different requirements than when we had running locally during development. In production, we want resiliency, monitoring, secret management, additional security, traffic management, auto-healing, scaling, and much, much more. This is where container orchestration platforms like Kubernetes come in, but they do a lot for you. Now, you can host your own Kubernetes clusters, or in most scenarios, use a managed Kubernetes service. For example, Azure has AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. AWS has EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service. GCP, Google Cloud Platform, has GKE, Google Kubernetes Engine. DigitalOcean has a Kubernetes offering, and there are tons more. But you don't have to use Kubernetes. A lot of web app hosting solutions support running containers. For example, let's have a quick peep at Azure Web Apps. So this is the Azure portal, and if I just say create a web app, then you can see down here that we can publish code or a Docker container. If we click on a Docker container, we can choose the operating system. So we've been doing Linux containers in this course. And note that if I go to code, look at the tabs along the top. If I go to Docker container, we've got Docker as the next step. It's got a quick start image, or I can choose like Docker Hub and specify the image and tag and the startup command. So remember when we spoke about CMDs. And if we choose a private one, we can specify the username and password of the container registry. So I'm not going to go any further here. I just wanted to show that just creating a web app using app services in Azure, for example, that you can still spin up containers. You don't have to use something like Kubernetes. Or if you're an Azure user and you do want a bit more of the power of Kubernetes, but you don't want to have to learn Kubernetes, there's something called Azure Container Apps. So if we create one of those, then we can give it a name. And in the same way, we can specify, so this says use quick start image. If we turn that off, we can specify our registry, we can specify the image and the tag. So all very familiar. We're just specifying what image we want this hosting solution to pull them down from. Again, we're not going to go any further here. I just wanted to show that again, it's the same concept. You're specifying the registry and the image, and this service is going to pull that down. So I've shown Azure services here because I'm an Azure user, so I know how to use them. But that doesn't mean you have to use Azure. AWS has EKS, which I've already mentioned. It also has ECS, Elastic Container Service, which is a fully managed containers management service. And it has Fargate, which is a serverless compute engine for containers, and perhaps more. So as you can see, there are tons of ways to host containers, and many more I've not mentioned, but they all follow the same pattern of downloading the images we've built, like we've been doing throughout this course, from an image registry, and then creating containers from that image, just like we've been doing throughout this course. And just like that, we've reached the end of this Docker journey together, but really it's just the beginning. By now you should have a good understanding of containers, images, building your own images, lots of Docker commands, including creating volumes for storage, custom networks, managing multiple containers with Docker Compose, and much, much more. As you've seen, there are many use cases for Docker, and you'll find more and more as you hit different requirements. And you'll get those aha moments where you think, I can use Docker for this. But do remember, learning never truly ends. As you know, the tech world evolves, and so does Docker. So stay curious and keep diving deeper, experiment and implement what you've learned, and just play, because that's the best way to learn and concrete that knowledge. So with that, I just want to say thank you for choosing this course, and feel totally free to reach out to me if you have any questions. You should be able to find me very easily on most social media platforms, and all of my links are on danclark.com. So until next time, happy coding.